I'm here with my guest, Evan Jones. He's the global CMO at Fender. I had the opportunity to moderate a panel earlier today at the gathering, or yesterday rather, the gathering. And thanks for being on the show. Glad to have you here.
My pleasure. It's been an awesome event, actually. As a first-time attendee, it's been great to get the recognition, but it's been, I think, even more interesting to talk to and see and watch so many smart people present.
What were your expectations coming in versus the reality of what this event's all about?
I don't know that I had a ton of expectations I think 7-8 years ago, the gathering had reached out and wanted to acknowledge Fender, and it just so happened that that event coincided with a board meeting. I couldn't make it, so our VP of Creative at the time, Jeremy Taylor, came, and he also didn't know what to expect, but he came home to LA, extremely positive about the experience, and I think had talked about just the cool factor of getting to kind of rub elbows and hang out with some pretty interesting people.
Yeah. Well, you've been at Fender for a while now, right? And you've probably meandered through a lot of different nooks and crannies of that organization. Can you just give us a summary of how has your career evolved within the confines of that organization?
Yeah, so I joined Fender in 2015, and amazingly, the company was heading into its 70th year, and I am the first CMO that the company's ever had, which I think probably there's a couple points that are relevant there. One is, prior to that moment, the company hadn't really invested heavily in consumer-driven marketing. A lot of it was trade-based, but there's some things the company was doing incredibly well, one of which was, in my opinion, I always describe it as mastering the art and science of making the world's best instruments, and not just making them, but crafting them and being so good at that. And the other thing it had done well is it had built a great reputation with artists. When I joined the company, there was massive artist share, onstage share, but to a large degree, the story of the brand hadn't yet really emerged.
Yeah. In your opinion, or validated by others as well?
I sort of say it this way. I think if I use a baseball analogy, the company was hyper-serving the committed player, which was akin to not just serving popcorn in the infield, but literally just in the dugout. And yet there were all these fans who I think wanted to come in and witness and attend the brand, but just weren't necessarily being invited in. So I think, said another way, I think the brand had not been in a position to invest in itself at the level that it needed to.
Okay.
And so when I joined, it was because the ownership had brought in a private equity partner in TPG Growth. And, it was the combination of the incredible sort of nurturing nature of the owner, Servco, with the working capital and the vision of TPG that created this really great 1 + 1 is 3 moment, where the vision was, how do you help this heritage guitar manufacturer really fully grow into this globally connected music, technology, and lifestyle brand? And so that was the job description.
Yeah, meaty
job description. And I think that's one of those job descriptions where there may be, to borrow the Nikeism, there is no finish line. But my role has been to come in and, from a marketing perspective, drive as much of that as possible. And that has been one of those dream jobs of a lifetime. It's also been an incredibly eye-opening experience of having to rebuild a marketing function from scratch.
Yeah.
Establishing a global vision for the brand, hiring, staffing, driving, and leading an organization down that path, then adding a digital capability to the organization, navigating COVID, the other side of COVID, and all of these things. But I think along the way, the journey has been super satisfying, both in terms of what we've done to grow the company, but also in terms of how we've opened up the brand to, I think, a whole new generation and audience of players.
Yeah, and we got a firsthand account of that with the stories you were sharing in the panel, like people that have built their careers around being invited in and using that as the jumping off platform, right? I'm curious, outside of, classic marketing skill set and strategy, what do you find yourself relying on as like a superpower to play your role and fulfill your mandate as a leader of people and a leader of a team? Is there something you keep going back to because it just feels like an old worn-in glove?
Well, I think if I sort of separate brand strategy and sort of the idea of brand development from people leadership just for a second,
sure.
Although those two things need to go hand in hand. I mean, I think I was fortunate in that the first 12 and a half to 13 years of my professional career I spent at Nike.
Oh, that helps.
But I started at Nike in what we affectionately referred to as the back office of Nike Austria.
Okay.
Working with 8 countries who all were distributors of the Nike brand, from Russia down to Greece. But that ended up being one of those super fortunate instances where, even though I grew up in Eugene and I probably had the Nike chip implanted in my head, right, I got to do things at an early stage in my career in terms of what I was asked to do that I never would have done had I started in the US, which is a much more developed organization. And over the first 8 years of my career with Nike, first in Vienna, then moved to Stockholm for a couple years, then to Amsterdam for 5 years, I got to be a part of a region that grew from 8 countries to 22 countries, from 35 million to 250 million.
Right.
Then I got to work on the Western European business, and then I got eventually moved back to the States and finally get into my dream job of running marketing for Nike basketball. Yeah. I only share all of that to say there were so many instances where I thought about leaving and going to grad school. And I would talk to my friends who were actually in business school, getting their degrees and using examples of that Nike case study. Hey, did you hear about the Tiger Woods thing? Hey, what do you think about this Brazilian soccer contract? And I realized that in many ways, I was getting paid to go to school and to get to do it in the first 8 years in a job that let me travel to every country in Europe and absorb culture. We often joke, my wife and I, that we left Europe with way more experience than equity.
Yeah.
But when I got back to the States, to then spend 5 years in the U.S. organization, there's just so much that came out of that has informed how I think about brand building, how I think about consumers, how I think about growth. And I think interestingly, there's so many of the sort of philosophical tenets of how Nike thought about athletes that we've been able to transfer into how Fender thinks about artists and about consumers and about community and about an expansive view of the brand that says you can simultaneously serve the best players on the planet while inviting new players into the brand. And so that's been, I think, a really rewarding and interesting journey.
That's, I think that most professionals and marketing leaders are sort of a fabric of the component parts along their journey, but it sounds like you are intentionally seeing your strength and your ability to fulfill the mandate. You're intentionally recalling those moments, those micro moments that kind of cohes today into the way you play the game.
Yeah, I think one of the things that Nike used to always say, that Nike had these maxims that were rolled out. I think they've been rolled out a bunch of times, and now the new CEO, H.E.R, who was like my boss's boss's boss when I was there, is kind of bringing some of that culture back. But one of the tenets and the maxims was the consumer decides. Another was always listen to the voice of the athlete. And another one, this wasn't how they said it, but I think about it, is, to borrow the X-Files, the truth is out there. And the reason I hit on those three is, I think as a leader and as an organization, and this may be where I can bridge some of the brand and leadership, you can get so caught up in the internal discussion. You can get so caught up in what the politics of the decision are going to be, or you can get so caught up on what the problems are that might come out of a bad decision and lose sight of the fact that the consumer can be sending you signals all the time. You just have to put yourself in a position to hear them. And that's not easy, because that's got to come into the company from multiple places. And a lot of times, if that signal comes in and is, quote, just a marketing thing, that's oftentimes where marketing teams will get into trouble. But I say that because I think one of the things I learned most at Nike was that consumer insight, that consumer voice might be some of the most powerful stuff on the planet. I've been a part of campaigns where something an athlete said went straight to print or straight to ad, or, something we heard. I remember we're going to a 7-on-7 football event in Hoover, Alabama, when I got to work on Nike football for a year. And this guy, who was like a 17-year-old emerging senior high school, we showed him, Jim Ford, who was our product guy, showed him a bunch of product, and then we got to talk about the sport. And there was this positioning idea of brutal athleticism. That was Nike's voice. And there was a campaign we were working on called Leave Nothing, and it came from a Sean Merriman quote that said,
yeah, I remember,
when I go all out, I leave nothing. And to hear this kid play all of that back and then some, and he even said something, he said, well, when I hit the season, my life is driven and defined by the 5 days till Friday. That literally became our grassroots campaign when we launched the football campaign. So I think there's just so many great signals out there if you're willing to listen and you're willing to give the consumer a little more authority. Yeah. But that's hard to do, and it's hard to do on a regular basis. But I always encourage my teams, whenever I've led them, to not be afraid to speak the truth, not be afraid to go find the truth. And, the other thing that I also kind of believe goes hand in hand with that is, when I say the truth is out there, it's also having data as a foundation. There can be phenomenal creative ideas in the world, but if you can't get them done, that's one thing. And if you're not really listening to the data, that's a problem. I'm probably saying something very obvious for a lot of people out there, but in terms of how I've always tried to think about it, getting good at mining those insights, I think is job one.
It sounds like one of your superpowers is sort of this at the intersection of being observant and curious, but calculated at the same time. And the answer is sometimes just sitting right there under our nose. Do we have the ears to listen and hear? And then can we leverage data to validate let's go forward with this?
Yeah, I think So I think when you think about, where great creative insight comes from or where great marketing comes from, I think it's really important that the marketing function and, ideally the organization embraces the idea that strategy matters.
Yeah.
That brand matters, that the data and analytics and insights, all of that matters. And if you're spending all your time negotiating and debating what the actual truth is, that's where organizations can fall down. And it's hard. It's hard to be a good listener as... Yeah. I don't even know what I'm saying right now.
No, I love it.
It's totally getting us going.
I'm curious, like in your time, maybe in the most recent few years at Fender, was there?
Can we stop for a second? Yeah. So that last bit,
yeah.
Can we try that again?
Sure. Yeah. Where do you want me to pick up from?
Well, I think I'm maybe going down a redundant space.
Oh.
But your question to me, what was your question?
So. Yeah, I want to revisit a question I had, which was, what do you believe, what do you feel is your superpower as a marketing leader? Mm-hmm. The thing that you just keep going back to time and time again because it's just so natural to you. Versus, if you don't mind, what would you claim your Achilles heel to be as a marketing leader? So start with, what's your superpower?
I think one of the things that matters most to me, and maybe to a fault, I sweat the details on a little bit too much, is to really be clear on what the strategy is. And the reason I say that is, as marketers and as organizations, we have so many decisions to make. And if you're not clear on what the strategy is, you can make strategy adjacent decisions.
What does that mean?
That means you think you're doing the right thing, but you haven't necessarily checked it back with the overarching strategy. And if everybody's playing that game, next thing you know, you have this really diffuse amount of activity. But I think one of the superpowers I believe I've been able to develop is to understand a market dynamic, a consumer dynamic, a core constituent dynamic, whether that's in our case working with artists or creators or influencers, and to be able to take all that, synthesize it into something that's easy to understand, digestible, and can be repeated in a sentence. Keep it as simple as possible because the world is extremely complex. Consumer landscapes are always changing. But if you're really clear on what you're looking to stand for, then from there, a lot of good things can happen.
Do you feel comfortable in being able and your ability to bring people back to the North Star? So you simplifying it so that people can interpret it and internalize it, but then inevitably we're going to steer. When you're working with teams of A-player high performers, we're going to steer your ability to bring it back.
Yeah, I think, look, I grew up playing both sports and music, and I was never a single sport or a single individual athlete. Like I always was a part of a team, and for me, it was basketball. Okay. And then at Fender, I've been able to play live with bands, with 4 or 5 people. And the reason I say that is I think I'm happiest when there's at least 4 or 5 other people in the mix. And the reason I share that is I think the best teams kind of always bring it back to the center. The best teams know what their identity is. The best teams know how they're going to compete. And look, the game may change. Someone may get injured, to use the analogy all the way through, but that doesn't change how the team thinks and operates. Yeah. The other thing is once teams get really good at operating together, that's when they start to grow collectively. And when you have 5 people on a team who are all growing, but coming from the same place, that's when amazing things happen.
Unstoppable.
And I think, whether or not I've been perfectly able to do that at Fender, that's always in my mind. Is how do we make sure that everybody's pulling in the same direction? There's always a finite amount of resources, but there's always an infinite number of opportunities. Yeah. So what's the path and how are we going to best pursue it?
In the last few years at Fender, has there been a moment where you've believed so passionately about something that you guys want to do, but you knew that there were a meaningful amount of skeptics that you were going to have to kind of plead your case to internally? Like, is there something that, and how do you, just generally, how do you go about that, going from, I believe that this is it, but I'm going to have to build a case internally, something that we all have to deal with?
Yeah, I mean, I think if I go back to the kind of first 5 years of my Fender journey, so much of what we were doing was looking to bring more people into the conversation.
Yeah.
And so for the people who'd been at the company for a long time and frankly had incredible knowledge and skill around serving the core committed consumer, the biggest fear I think people had was we would somehow alienate the consumers who made Fender what it was. Yeah. And to be clear, that has never and was never an intention of mine or the organization's. Our focus was more, how do we add more people to that party? And so to introduce new people, to get new audiences, you have to do new things. And one of the things that was interesting to me was how we think about our artist signature program. And there's a signature program at Fender is it's kind of like getting a Nike signature shoe. What opened my eyes, I remember we had both Bono and Edge on the board when I started at Fender, and we did a signature Stratocaster with Edge, and I remember walking the factory floor with him, and he saw the wall where all the signature necks were up on the wall, and he saw his Guitar Hero's favorite neck, and the fact that he could put his neck on the wall. Here's an artist who certainly doesn't need the money.
Everything.
But for him, it was a really critical moment. And so understanding that reaction, and now taking that and moving a few years ahead, there was a young artist that we worked with named H.E.R, Gabby. Yeah. And in 2016, she was still kind of finding her voice and emerging. But 4 or 5 years later, she was becoming one of the most culturally interesting and resonant artists. And oh, by the way, phenomenal guitar player. Yeah. And we undertook the idea of actually making her a signature guitar. And mind you, at that point, Fender was heading into its 75th year. And that was going to make her the first Black female artist to ever have a signature guitar. But what was disruptive about it is the model prior to that was to have achieved some level of professional accomplishment. 4 or 5 albums on tour for 10 or 15 years. Right. And so what we were doing was kind of disrupting that model. And I think, to be fair, we were very careful because we value the artist relationships we have so much. And the last thing we wanted to do was to send a signal to anybody that we didn't value it. On the other hand, we had to push that project through the organization. And I think ultimately, when that project came to life, it was successful when it launched. And I think being able to have her as part of the Nike brand, and it was important for her to actually be able to speak to that journey. What I think really sealed the deal for everybody 5 months later was when she actually played that guitar at the Super Bowl. And I think, that's when kind of everything clicked. Now, look, there's not 1,000 artists out there like her. Yeah. But I think that's an instance of us having decided that we wanted to open the aperture, bring more people into the category, especially looking at female artists who can represent the brand. And then her, where she was in her journey, it was kind of this magical moment where those things came together. Yeah. And I think later it really helped everybody kind of think differently about how we should be tackling.
Based on that, what advice would you would you give to senior marketing leaders, CMOs, who need to push things through the organization that are going to require some significant pushing?
I mean, look, I think the fact is, if you're looking to drive any sort of transformation, you can't do it alone. No. And if it's just a marketing driven thing, maybe it'll last for a year or two. But in my case, what was really important was, one, that we had full support of the CEO. Yeah. And the fact that we were totally simpatico with him on that mission, that makes all the difference. Yeah. But it's just as important to me that my peers at the executive level, for sure, even if they don't fully agree with the strategy, they understand it, and that there is a real clear message that there is a willingness to learn together and to be open to, in my case, experience and a legacy of information that I didn't have when I walked in about the music instruments industry, but finding a way to take that in and make it a shared journey, as opposed to everybody here doesn't get it, marketing is going to fix everything.
Which is the easy impulse answer.
Yeah, it's an easy impulse answer, but it leads to short-term outcomes. And I'm not even going to say short-term benefits, short-term outcomes. And I think, I was very aware that the average tenure of a CMO coming in was probably 18 months. I wasn't going to be that CMO. And so much of what we've driven, and I think it's so important for CMOs to think of yourself not just as a consumer evangelist, not just as an agent of change, not just as a consumer voice, not just as a source of truth for what the brand needs to be, or a protector or a disruptor. You've got to be a business partner. You've got to be a growth partner. You can be an instigator. You can put ideas on the table that make people uncomfortable. But then it's almost more important that when you bring that idea to market, if you have to give up 10, 15, 20% of that idea to get 100% buy-in, you're going to go twice as far with the team. Because back to the basketball analogy or sports analogy or band analogy, you can't do it alone. And I think that's something I embrace. I think it's actually something I also invite. I think the Fender team has been a pretty magical combination, certainly for the first 5 to 7 years of just tremendous growth. But I think it's because all of us were willing to sort of look across the table and acknowledge, okay, there's some differences of opinion, but there's a higher calling here that is, yes, growth, but it's also this bigger jet stream of music. And we were, I think, excited to try to grow that.
I'm curious about, taking away things like earning a paycheck and accomplishing great campaigns. Where do you find your greatest source of fulfillment right now in your role? What fills your cup about it besides the obvious things that?
I mean, I think when I joined the company, again, going back to my personal experience of having played music and sports my whole life, it's something I shared in the keynote here. I mean, at Nike, we used to always say that there's few things that transcend geography and culture and demographics and religious differences and political differences like music and sports. Yeah. Obviously, now that I'm at Fender, I have a biased opinion. and yet I think there's a lot of truth to that. It's one of the oldest forms of human communication. It's also one of the greatest connectors. It allows people to see and hear and experience things differently. And so to be able to be in a position to actually help open up that aperture, bring more people in, I think that was probably one of the most rewarding aspects of the journey. And, I remember when we first were getting started, we had a lot of debate about, how we're going to measure success. And of course, we had all the KPIs and all the deliverables, and we had to keep everybody happy. And of course, that's never easy. You have to do it. You have to adhere to that. But I remember, saying to my team, and we talked about it, like, how great would it be if 5, 6, 7 years from now, there's a new generation of young artists who come in and whether they say it overtly or however, that they felt like they could do it because of what Fender was doing.
Yeah.
And that moment happened for me. And I think it was 2022. We were launching a new series of guitars and we invited 2 female artists, April K and Blue Tiger, to an event. And unprompted, they both shared that one of the reasons they felt like they could build that career was because they saw what Fender was doing and they felt supported by Fender. One of those artists went on to be the first female bass player to have a signature guitar. That wasn't by design, but that's because really we didn't know where it was going to go. We met her in 2015, 2016. She was a bass player and a DJ in New York. We maintained that relationship. We tried to support her at every step, but then it got to a point where she was one of the most accomplished bass players in music.
Yeah.
And it was inevitable. So I think, for me, that's been one of the most rewarding parts. I think the other rewarding aspect of this is, we've been able to hire and bring in some incredible people. And, we've brought in people who may not be guitar players, but have a passion for music and have a passion for doing great things. So I think that's been one of the other most enjoyable aspects, is just the human factor of being able to create, assemble, develop, and nurture a team. It hasn't been perfect. There's always been, and there always will be, hard decisions and changes and shifts. But I think the opening of the aperture and also the development of kind of the organization and culture, I think those are things that I'm very proud of.
I would be proud of that too. That's pretty incredible. If you're comfortable sharing this, Evan, it doesn't matter how much we've accomplished, how senior we are. At the end of the day, at some level, we are human people, right? And I'm curious about, how do you, when inevitably that voice tells us, hey, you're doing this wrong and you suck, or you're in a critical leadership role, how do you soften that voice or eliminate that voice and carry on? Are there any tips or tricks?
I mean, that's a big question. I think there's the personal stuff, is surrounding yourself with good people. I think there's, in my case, I clearly married up in my life. I have a phenomenal support.
Output your coverage.
I totally did. There's also, I think, my outlets tend to be some combination of working out and playing music. So those are cathartic. But in terms of kind of, I guess, the conviction, and when you're in that doubt mode, I think what's helped me is a combination of things. It's, I think, kind of going back to the well of why you're here, what you're trying to do, and taking a minute to remind yourself about that. I think it's also, in my case, I've been fortunate to actually have a board who are engaged and have incredible wisdom to offer. And so having those conversations can be so helpful. Even if they're not in the day-to-day, sometimes getting that outside perspective is great. And then, I think part of it is just a straightforward view of just honesty with your team. And there's been so many instances where there's been something we've had to decide or do, and I've felt like, okay, this is on me, and I'm willing to make that call, but I have pulled in maybe a couple of the leaders on my team or a couple of peers and say, look, this is the question. This is the issue we're facing.
Yeah.
Here's what I'm thinking. How do you feel?
The fact that you feel comfortable, because even in the act of doing that, you're basically signaling that I don't have every single answer, right? Which not every leader does.
Well, it's like, I think we all hate the big reveal.
Yeah, sure.
And what I mean by that is, the executive team went away and perfectly nailed the decision and issued the edict from the mountaintop and everybody snap in line. There's moments where you need to have that alignment. Yeah. But I've always believed, part of actually developing my team is actually including them in the decision making.
People support what they help create.
That's exactly right. And if you feel like you've had a hand in it, you feel like even if your voice didn't lead to the exact outcome, but it contributed in some way, now you've got a partner. And now it's not just my decision, it's our decision.
Yeah.
Because go back to marketing, let's say you've got 4 or 5 department leads, they each have people on their teams, but they've got intercompany relationships too. And it becomes a form of internal marketing and evangelism and all of that. And I've always subscribed to that. That's to the best of my ability.
That's not easy to do, and not a lot of people do it. I think about the people support what they help create, but then it's those late nights at the office where then confirmation bias kicks in. You're like, I had a hand in building this, and I'm going to evangelize about it as if it was my idea because I had a hand in building it, right? And I'm going to burn the midnight oil because it was my idea.
Well, and sometimes it's just really good to be transparent about that.
Yeah.
So there's been instances where the answer might be, heard everybody's feedback. It was really good feedback. I think we're going to do this instead.
Yeah.
And let's see what happens.
Yeah.
And honestly, there's also power in that if you're willing to deal with the outcome.
Yeah, exactly.
And if the outcome is not good, then treating that as a moment to actually be vulnerable, to learn as a team. I think, I haven't always been perfect in that, but to try to find those moments to say, look, we didn't get this right, but to show the team like, so what? Let's move on. I think that's also important because, when people are in fear mode, they're not their best and you make bad decisions. You second guess yourself. You stop thinking past the present and you forget about the future. And I think for marketers, especially to be successful, you've got to be able to walk and chew gum.
Yeah.
You got to be able to hit this year's number and then think about the next 2 to 3 years of where the brand's going because, every act you make has to somehow deliver purpose in some way, shape, or form.
Love that. Leave us with this one. I got one more for you. And it's when maybe the career is done and the CMO title is stripped or any title that you have, like what do you hope that your legacy of influence on the teams that you were a part of and the brands that you're a part of, some of the things, what comes into clarity for you in terms of your hope?
Wow. I guess I'm going to skip the business answer.
Okay.
And
good.
In the sense of it's not about how much revenue we generated. It's not about how EBITDA we delivered. Those matter, but I do subscribe to that idea that people typically remember how you made them feel. And I would love it if the people who've worked in my organization or as part of my team would feel like in some way, shape, or form they learned or grew or developed. And it's another version of, people always talk about leave a brand in a better place than when you found it. I agree. I also think help people be better on the way out or after you leave, or frankly, just to help people grow and develop to where they want to go. Because I think that's so important when you have people who are actively doing great work, but they're also seeing growth and potential. Like that matters. And I can't say that I've totally nailed that all the time. It's a hard thing to get right because it's hard to make every function and every person feel like it's all equally, coming together.
We're not meant to bat 1,000, right? But we all are meant to understand what does it mean what do you got to do when you step up to the plate?
Yeah. And so if it's, hey, I know when I was a part of Evan's team or when Evan was here, like we had a chance to do some of our best work. I had a chance to grow and develop. I had a chance to take a swing. My voice mattered. And I had a chance to get to a better place. I think those would be great things. And then, on the bigger brand scale, I think with Fender specifically, it's to walk in at the 70th year and to now be heading into the 80th year. There are people in our organization who've been in the company for 30, 40, 50 years. And so in many ways, I'm still like a freshman. But to think that even in 10 years, I'd love to think that we've added a level of transformation and amplification and acceleration in a good way that didn't exist. I think that's something you can't really quantify, even though there's lots of ways to do that.
Actually, one more thing, and the last thing is that when you and your team and the group look at the maybe 5 to 10 year horizon for Fender, what is starting to come into clarity right now? Like where Fender seems to be, even though at 70 plus years, like now it's on a bullet train, it feels like, again. And maybe that's so. But what's going to be true for Fender in the next few years?
I think that's a big question. I think the company is actually still trying to figure that out, because coming off of COVID, so much has changed. There was a massive influx of players who came into the category because everybody had free time. That's leveled out a bit. And now it's sort of getting the train back on the tracks, which has been a lot of the last couple years. But, music is never changing. So,
No.
is ever changing.
Yeah.
And so the advent of digital tools and what that means, I think that's an interesting thread that the company's trying to pull pretty hard on.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that I believe is true is consumers truly want direct relationships with brands they love. And it just so happens that there's a lot of consumers who love Fender. There's a flagship store in Tokyo that is absolutely serving as a beacon for brand experience. The team that put it in place there, I think, has done a phenomenal job of building the ultimate sort of temple to guitar.
Okay.
I give Bud Cole, our president out there, just a lot of props. There's a 50-foot LED screen that might be the single biggest digital board for any sort of guitar manufacturer and brand. But I think what it's showing the organization is there is a real desire to have that relationship. We can't build flagship stores.
Yeah.
Fender can't build flagship stores everywhere. Yeah. But I think if the company can crack the code on what the direct relationship looks like, but do it in a way that can also bring the entirety of the sort of distribution of guitars along the way.
Yeah.
There's a ton of independent dealers out there that have a huge amount of passion for the brand. They're fighting the good fight. They don't have the same resources as the Fender brand does. There's big players who also have resources who are trying to figure it out. I think the industry as a whole is facing some challenges in terms of how do you have the industry grow to meet the demand? How do you have the experiences change to meet the consumers where they are? Yeah. So I think a lot of it is going to really orient around what is the definition of how the brand operates in an increasingly digital landscape. Yeah. And how does the brand create even more meaningful long-term relationships? And I mean that in the sense of true LTV, true brand expansion, where, bringing somebody in you can do, but then how do you connect that relationship over time? There's nothing about buying a guitar that's transactional.
No.
And we've learned a lot about that, but that is easy to say. It is difficult to put into a business model, but I think it's going to be one of the biggest unlocks for the future. And I'm just proud that, over the last 10 years, at least we've been able to create a bigger platform and a kind of next level starting point.
That's the story's being written, and I'm sure you're excited about holding the pen a lot of the time in writing this. So everyone, my guest, Evan Jones, thank you so much for sharing a little bit. Final word, gathering, what would you give it in a summary? Your first time, your experience?
I don't know if I could put a single word to it.
Single sentence.
But I'd say enlightening and eye-opening in a good way. And I think also this clear sort of sense of community has been palpable and has been cool to see. And in some respects, I mean, because you're sitting up here in Banff, I guess you have to say monumental.
Yeah, that's right.
The backdrop is pretty powerful, and it's pretty good context.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Evan. Appreciate it.